Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 21st of May of 2025. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's talk about the northern directions. Once again, let's discuss video that was published today by the Russian sources. In this video, according to pro-Russian resources, we can see another military camp or training camp of the 1st Separate Special Forces Brigade of the Ukraine Armed Forces near the settlement of Shostka in Sumy Oblast. The Russians, when they discovered this concentration of forces, attacked this area immediately. And as a result of Iskander strike, Ukraine losses amounted to 70 Ukrainian servicemen, including 20 instructors. Some sources reported that there were instructors from foreign countries. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians destroyed one ammo depot and up to 10 vehicles. So this is very interesting situation because when talking about the Ukrainian side, of course, they confirmed this strike because there were no reason to hide this information, but the Ukrainians reduced losses from their side, and according to Ukrainian information, the Ukrainians lost just 6 soldiers killed and 10 soldiers wounded. But this video is not the most important thing I would like to discuss with you. The most interesting updates are coming from the Bryansk region, so from this territory. Today the Russian sources reported that Ukrainians sent up to 70 soldiers, 70 let's say special soldiers of sabotage and reconnaissance group, and this group of forces managed to reach almost the city of Bryansk. So you know that there is very huge, probably the biggest in Europe, Bryansk forest. We're talking about this territory. And as I understand, and according to information we have, the Russians don't have complete or full control over this territory because of the fact that this is a very big forest and it is obviously difficult to do. When the Russians discovered the Ukrainian soldiers inside of this forest, of course, they did everything they can, but they blocked this territory from many directions. As for the information by the end of the 21st of May of 2025, there are still clashes on the territory of this forest, and the Russians are still trying to clear this area completely. So this is the situation. Once again, as we see, and according to information we have, the Ukrainians during the previous several days were concentrating their forces on the territory of this huge forest. And as for the beginning of the 21st of May of 2025, several groups of Ukrainian soldiers, up to 70 soldiers, some sources report about 100 servicemen, were discovered in the area and in the vicinity of the capital of this oblast, in the vicinity of Bryansk. We're talking about this territory. At least the Russian sources reported that Ukrainians were spotted in the vicinity of the settlement of Lopush. Later, we got report that the Russians, using Iskander missile, attack another training camp in the vicinity of Shostka, so basically several kilometers from the border. And obviously the Ukrainians that were trained on the territory of this camp obviously later were planned to send to the territory of the Bryansk forest. So as I understand, during the previous 24 or 48 hours the Russians managed to discover some special operation that was prepared by the Ukrainians. Most likely the Ukrainians probably during the next stage of war with the Russian side or with the Russians, or during the summer military campaign, were planning to establish complete control over this huge forest and to dig in deeper, with the purpose not to allow the Russians to restore control over this territory. Obviously, and we know that since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians have the biggest problems the Russians had always during the fights on the territory of any forest, because you can't use drones, your intelligence worked not so good because you can't see Ukrainian soldiers behind trees and leaves and grass, and during the summer period of time, if you answer this forest and if you are able to establish complete control with this territory, most likely, let's say, the Russians would not be able to force the Russians to fall back, to force the Ukrainians to fall back very fast. So the Russians most likely reveal this, let's say, plan of Ukrainian forces. Now, most likely, the Ukrainians either have to intensify their activities and to begin their prepared operation, or they're gonna have to fall back from this territory, or they will be encircled by the Russians. So let's keep an eye on this situation. We expect additional updates from this territory. Now let's talk about the Sumy direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation, and according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours or 48 hours, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village of Lokhnya. This information was reported yesterday, and yesterday we got several geolocations from the southern part of this village. In this video, for example, we can see how Ukrainians were attacking the edge positions of the Russian forces in the southern part of the settlement. Several attacks, and based on this video, most of the mappers adjusted their maps. Furthermore, yesterday we got first reports from pro-Russian sources that the village of Loknya was taken by the Russians completely. And during the 21st of May, we got additional changes on the ground that were provided by neutral, reliable resources. So as of the end of the 21st of May, we almost have no doubts that the Russians secured the village. We are waiting for another report of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, and when it comes, we will adjust the map completely. As of now, the Ukrainians are preparing themselves to meet the Russians in the northern part of Yunakivka, and most likely the clashes have already started. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kharkiv direction. During the previous 24 hours, and not just during the previous 24 hours, during the previous months, we got lots of important updates and interesting updates from this area. If you remember, we discussed this situation several weeks ago, and we noted that we have very huge activities of the armored force of the Russian Federation to the north of the city of Kharkiv. The Ukrainian sources published lots of videos. For example, in this video that was published on the 17th of May, we can see how another Russian convoy of vehicles was moving in the direction of the positions of the 92nd Brigade. In this video, we can see, for example, how another group of Russian units and vehicles were moving towards the village of Zhuravka and how Ukrainians were attacking the Russians in this area. So obviously, we see a huge concentration of Russian forces. But as for the, let's say, end of the 21st of May of 2025, the Russians still haven't started any activities, but they continue concentration. On the other side, we start receiving lots of updates from the village of Volchansk. For example, today we made significant adjustments of the map. We have lots of geolocations. First, let's discuss this one. In this video that was published by the 57th Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, by their FPV drone operator squad, we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in different parts of the city of Volchansk. But the most important part is this one. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians were attacking a Russian soldier that was located, that was inside of the river. So this episode took place exactly in this point. So we see that the Russians most likely have free access on the Ukrainian side of the river of Volcha. The Russians can enter this industrial zone. Most likely, most of the territories between the northern part of Volchansk, let's say the central Volchansk, is something like a gray zone. Probably the Russians don't have complete control over this territory, but obviously the Russians have possibilities to send sabotage and reconnaissance group on the Ukrainian side with the purpose to deal Ukrainian damage and to carry out reconnaissance operations. So based on this video, we have adjusted the map along the river itself. Furthermore, during the day, the Ukrainian sources published this video that was published also by Ukrainian sources, and in this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking the Russians in the most eastern part of the city of Volchansk with FPV drones. There are lots of episodes. The video is 37 seconds length. Lots of buildings were damaged and destroyed, and several episodes were geolocated. One of the explosions took place exactly in this point, another one took place exactly in this area. So based on this report, based on these two videos, as we can see, we have adjusted, and we see that currently, and this is the situation, for example, by the way, by the end of the 20th of May, and this is the situation by the end of the 21st of May. So we see that the Russians are about to finish the battle for the northern part of the city of Volchansk, and then the Russians will be able to move further. Furthermore, as we can see, the Ukrainians still have some positions in the most northern part of the city of Volchansk, but we believe that due to the situation on the eastern flank, we expect that Ukrainians during the next 48 or 72 hours will completely abandon their positions, and they will move in the southern part of the city, which will allow the Russians to finish the battle for the northern part, to finish or to begin regrouping, and then the Russians will be able to move further in the southern direction to cross the river of Vovcha and to finish the battle for the city of Volchansk itself. Furthermore, today we continue receiving different reports from these huge forests to the east of the city of Volchansk. Today, several Russian and Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians finished the battle for the most western and the northwestern parts of these forests. So these territories already under complete Russian control. At least several sources, very reliable sources, reported about this. We are waiting for additional geolocations, of course. As for the end of the 21st of May of 2025, Ukrainians controlled just this part of the forest, but we understand that most likely the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back. Furthermore, I would like to point your attention, I would like to remind you that during April and during the May of 2025, the Russians were bombing and attacking the bridges, pontoon bridges, river crossings in this area, and Ukrainians currently have very poor logistics. So maybe this is the reason why the Ukrainians are going to fall back from this area completely. But this is also not the most important. The Ukrainian sources and lots of very reliable Ukrainian military experts published today a very interesting article regarding the situation in this area. The Russians are preparing active assaults in the Kharkiv direction. The head of the charter headquarters. The Ukrainian military is recording the accumulation of Russian personnel near the state border, but the defense force are ready to repel attacks. Obviously, what else can they say? So after the Russians managed to restore complete control over the Sumy region, after the Russians managed to establish more or less reliable secure zone in this area, after the Russians repelled Ukraine attempts to attack in the area of Tyotkina, we see that the Russians decided to resume their attempts to move deep inside of the territory of Kharkiv Oblast in the vicinity of Volchansk. And probably this is the reason why the Ukrainians were planning to begin another offensive in the Bryansk forest with the purpose to stop and to slow down the Russians and not to allow them to begin this offensive. But most likely this time the Russians had enough of information, and Ukrainian plans regarding the Bryansk region, the Bryansk direction were discovered in time, and Russians managed to cut and to ruin Ukrainian plans. Now we expect Russian activities or intensification of Russian activities in this area in the very near future. Obviously, first of all, the Russians need to be 100% sure that Ukrainians are not able to do anything in the Bryansk region, and only then the Russians will continue. But we are not talking about months, so yes, obviously this is going to happen during the next several weeks. Furthermore, we expect that the Russians are going to resume their attempts to attack and their offensive operation in the northern Kupiansk direction. As for the end of the 21st of May of 2025, we believe that it's already up to 1 month left since the beginning of Russian operational pause in this direction. Obviously, we haven't received anything from this area for 1 month, which means that it's not like the situation when the Russians didn't make any attempts. The Russians were regrouping. They were bringing additional forces, they were restoring their units, their brigades, their battalions, and we expect and we believe that in the very near future the Russians will finish this process. And this is the reason why the Russians increase their activities in Volchansk, because first of all, if the Russians want to continue offensive operation, it's better for them to move from both directions, from the northwestern direction from the city of Volchansk, and of course from the southeastern and the eastern direction from the river of Oskol. Only in this case, in this particular case, the Russians will be able to get as many as possible and as much as possible results. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Liman-Siversk direction. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special, just the same thing that we discussed during the previous update. The Russians continue offensive operation in the area of the village of Ridkadub, and the Russians continue offensive in the area of Siversk. We discussed the situation during the previous video. I'll remind you that according to this update, according to this video that was published by the Ukrainian sources, the Russians managed to establish complete control, almost complete control over this village of Verkhnykamenska. In this video we can see how Ukrainians with the use of FPV drones were attacking and bombing Russian positions on the territory of the central and the western parts of the village of Verkhnykamenska. Based on this video, most of the mappers adjusted their maps. When talking about neutral reliable sources, according to them, the southern part of the settlement was also captured by the Russians during the previous 24 hours. So we expect that during the next probably report or the next 2 days, the Russians, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, will confirm this information as well. Furthermore, we received today lots of videos from the Siversk itself. The Russians published this video where they were bombing and attacking the temporary deployment points of Ukraine and FPV operator base. But when talking about this explosion, this attack, we don't see anything special. The Russians managed to discover Ukraine position, and then the Russians destroyed position. The most important video is coming from the most northwestern part of the city. Let's discuss this video in details, and I have lots of questions. For example, in this video we can see how Russians were attacking tanks and vehicles that were moving towards the city of Siversk, and as a result of these attacks, Ukrainian lost at least 2 or 3 vehicles. So the question is, what exactly do we see during this video? Because as you can see, most of those attacks took place in the most northwestern part of the city of Siversk, which means that the Russians were attacking Ukrainian Ukrainian vehicles that were trying to answer the city of Siversk from the west. So basically, this is the situation when the Russians managed to establish complete FPV drone fire control over one of the most important logistic roads that goes in the direction of Siversk. We are talking about the road between the city and Slaviansk agglomeration. This is the road, and this road goes in the direction of Siversk from the west. And now we see that the Russians destroyed at least 2 vehicles that were trying to enter. So once again, what have we just seen? Either it was just a regular activity of the Russian forces, some Russian FPV drone operator managed to enter this territory and just destroyed 2 vehicles that were trying to enter the city of Siversk, or that was something like complete control over the territory, and from now on we are going to receive more and more videos of this type exactly from this area. So of course we are waiting for additional updates, because if we continue receiving videos from this part of the city of Siversk, this gonna mean that the Russians establish complete control over the main supply roads, and the Russians are about to begin another major offensive operation with the purpose to establish complete control over the city of Siversk and to begin the battle for the Slaviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. So let's keep an eye on this situation, because now this is very important to understand. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kliban-Bykska direction, about the N32 road, and about the city of Konstantinovka. As usually, we received lots of updates from this area. And first, let's talk about the most southern part of the Kliban-Byksky pocket, where the Russians managed to improve their positions. Let's compare the maps. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 20th of May of 2025. And as you can see, we have lots of territories under complete Ukraine control. We have some territories that were marked by the pro-Ukrainian sources deep state as a contested area. And when talking about it, the end of the 21st of May, we see that the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. As of the end of the 21st of May, we still haven't received a single geolocation that can confirm this huge progress of the Russians, but we believe that in a day or in 2 days we're going to receive some geolocation that will confirm this. The most important from this progress is that the Russians, according to neutral mappers and according to pro-Russian resources, managed to establish almost complete control over the village of Stara Nikolaevka. By the end of the 21st of May, the Russians have established control for more than 60% of the village. The Ukrainians currently control just the most northeastern part, and we expect that Ukrainians will fall back from this area during the upcoming 24-48 hours. And once again, the main reason why Ukrainians would abandon their positions is that the Russians continue advancing in the area of Romanovka. So the Russians continue pushing from the east, trying to get as close as possible to the main evacuation roads. And if it happens, we understand Ukrainians will lose any possibilities for evacuation. Furthermore, the Russians continue advancing. Most likely there are very heavy clashes in the western direction. So that is why the Russians turn their attention in the northeastern direction. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions, and as we discussed in the previous videos, exactly from the village of Romanovka, the Russians will try to outflank the Ukrainians in Shcherbenovka and Spassk and to attack the village of Katerinovka. So something like this is currently happening here, as we can see. This will also force the Ukrainians to fall back from the villages of Shcherbenovka and Novospassky in the very near future. So the situation is very difficult for the Ukrainians in this direction. We don't see any chances for Ukrainians to hold their lines, and most likely the Ukrainians will try to stabilize the situation along the villages of Yablunovka, Alexandra, Kalinova, and the Kliban-Bytska water reserve. But it doesn't mean that they will be able to do this. Most likely they will win some day, 2 or even week, but we see that the Russians are tasked to take this territory as soon as possible. Furthermore, when talking about the northwestern flank of the Kliban-Byksky pocket, we see that the Russians improved their positions as well. And according to several mappers, by the end of the 21st of May of 2025, the Russians managed to reach the village of Yablunovka from the southwest. So the Russians, according to several pro-Russian resources, are about to answer the village itself. And of course, if the Russians are able to answer this village and to provide geolocations or even to provide reports reports presented by reliable sources, this can be a huge media victory for the Russians. Imagine yourself what can think Ukrainians that are currently located in Zarya and Stara Nikolaevka if they receive update or a piece of news that the Russians entered the village of Yablunovka. For them, this is going to be a very clear signal that they're about to be captured and encircled by the Russians, which means that they will start retreating immediately. They will start abandoning their positions, sometimes even without receiving or getting any order from Ukrainian commanders. So attacking the direction of Yablunovka is just a very important media attack, a mental attack on Ukrainian soldiers that are located deep inside and deep far inside of these pockets. So this is going to be something like a thunder for Ukrainians in the southern pocket. Now let's move further. As for the, let's say, western bank of the N32 road, the Russians continue offensive. Today we got several updates from different mappers. Today we got reports from pro-Ukrainian sources, from pro-neutral resources, and from pro-Russian resources. And all of them were saying just about one thing. The Russians continue offensive operation in the northern direction, trying to expand their positions along N32 road. And according to, for example, pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. So there are three zones, as you know, according to Deep State. There is a Russian-controlled territory, Ukrainian-controlled territory, and we have a gray zone. So as you can see, the Ukrainians are showing a very huge, very big gray zone to the north of the village of Nova Poltavka. So basically, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, everything inside of this, let's say, white line is already considered by the Ukrainians as a contested area, which means that there are Russian soldiers, that there are very heavy clashes, and that the Ukrainians have some doubts whether these territories are still under complete Ukrainian control. So we expect that during the next 48 hours, these territories would be colored in Russian favor, which means that the battle for the villages of Popo Yar, Poltavka, and Rusin Yar will begin very, very soon, and probably even sooner than we can think about. Now let's move further. As for the Pokrovsk direction, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special, just another confirmation from pro-Ukrainian sources that the village of Novoalexandriivka was taken, but according to different mappers and geolocations and even the Minister of Defense report of Russian Federation, this territory was taken a long time ago. As for the South Donetsk direction, during the previous 24 hours, as you can see, the Russians improved their positions. The most important adjustments of the map to the south of the village of Odradne, the Russians, as a result of offensive, took under control this contested area. We came to this based on the video that was published by the Ukrainian sources. We're talking about this video. Here we can see Ukrainian FPV drone attacks on Russian positions in the fields. So we have proofs that the Russians established complete control over this territory. Furthermore, we see that the Russians established complete FPV drone control over the settlement of Kamar, which means that the Russians are about to begin another offensive or major offensive operation in this area with the purpose to take under control the villages of Kamar, Fyodorovka, and Perebudova. So this is the next target for the Russians, and most likely the Russians maybe will try to outflank Odradne without fighting for Odradne, and they will begin fighting for Kamar even earlier. If the Russians answer this territory, the Ukrainians most likely from the village of Odradne would be forced to fall back, otherwise they would be caught in cauldron by the Russian forces. So the situation remains very difficult. When talking about the South Donetsk direction, there are very heavy clashes for Zelene Pole and Novopol. Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians managed to caught in cauldron the units of the 31st and the presidential brigades, and which is obviously very, very bad for Ukrainians. Furthermore, we got reports that several battalions of defense brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine abandoned their positions, and this, let's say, abandoning of the positions led to cauldrons. So the situation is very difficult, and the situation remains very tense for Ukrainians. So of course, let's wait and see what is going to be next. But today we got another very bad piece of news from the West. Today, Donald Trump, the president of the United States of America, reported that he strongly believes that Russia will win this war. In response to demands from Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, to impose sanctions against Russia. Donald Trump said that only the U.S. president himself could decide it. It will be my decision, no one else. We will see what Russia does, how it behaves. But once again, he confirmed that he believes that Russia is going to win this war, and this is obviously a huge strike media attack on Ukraine and Ukrainian people. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.